Shalom, guys, and welcome to Wisdom into Our Ministries. It's always a pleasure and truly an honor to be here with you. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share some of the stuff that I'm learning. Remember, wisdomintorah.com. We're studying this year all the commandments in every commandment in the context of agriculture, legality, geography, topography, and going through all the 613 commandments found in each Torah portion. And this week's Torah portion talks about the red heifer, para aduma. And there are many controversies in trying to understand something that even Judaism really doesn't understand the ritual, because the ritual is what is considered a chok, or something without an explanation. And many, for example, give me 1 second, guys, I apologize. Many, for example, considered to be like some kind of weird ritual, and when like a magical thing. When you study ancient Near Eastern history, the way I have for many years, and you start comparing the motivation and the reason why God gave this commandment, it has nothing to do with any comparison with the ancient world or trying to imitate the ancient world. The problem is that in the ancient world, they all lived according to the same fears. And this particular command, if you follow the commandments in the Torah, the whole section, the last 4 weeks, I think 3 weeks ago, there in the Torah portion, there was an incident in which some of the people were ritually unclean with corpse impurity. Now, this is very important. Corpse impurity was paramount in the ancient world. Being unclean, touching a dead person or something dead, even in the ancient world, was considered something you didn't want to deal with, because they thought that the demon spirit will take over the dead person. And everything was connected with demonology. And there's a book that I have that I don't have time to get right now, but it's by John Walton, talks about this. It's called Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology. It's a very, very, very good book. So if we put ourselves in the geographical environment of the narrative in the Bible, we will really get a greater understanding of why this was important to the Israelites, that they came to Moses and they say, hey, Moses, we got a problem. What if we cannot keep Passover? And that's really the whole idea. How come we cannot keep Passover if we touch a dead person? Clearly, in the camp, they were dying, because God made a decree that that first generation would not live to see 20 and older, would not live to see the promised land. So people are dying in the camp. And when you recognize sacred space, and I don't have it in English, I have it in Spanish, but when you have it as sacred space, one of the things that we're studying, sacred space in the ancient world was very important. Just like sacred space in your house is very important. There's a common area. There's a kitchen that is sacred space to any woman who cooks. You don't like people coming to your house and telling you what to do. And your bedroom, when you have the place where you sleep with your wife, the bedroom where you both sleep at night, that is sacred space. No one's supposed to lay on that bed except your wife and your husband. That's it. Anybody else will be encroaching in that particular scenario. All right. So sacred space in the temple was the same. Now, this is what really makes sense for me. When I began to study this, it seems odd reading these particular portions, because I did not understood the motivation. But then God tells them, in chapter 19, he gives the answer to the problem for the first Passover, whoever could not take the Passover because of corpse impurity. The temple of God, that many don't like to study and many disregard. And if we understood the temple of God, we would recognize the importance as to why God wants us to live in the realm of life. Even while we eat, he gives us the animals that are not animals of prey, because the animals, they're eating the dead. You're not to consume them, because we are supposed to be, as a kingdom, a temple to God. So if we are eating something that eats the dead, something dead that is animals of prey, or a pig who is a trash collector, and same thing as anything that has a function to collect things that are dead. then we are profaning our temple. So he makes a parallel between his house and the purity in his house compared to this house and the purity he wants us to preserve from moral behavior and immorality to what we eat is all connected. All right. To enter the temple, there were rules. And the rules are set there by the Lord. The Lord establishes the rules. He is the one who tells us what to do, what not to do, and what to eat, what not to eat, how far we can go and how far we cannot go, who can go and who cannot go. So the notion, and we're going to read this particular verse, and the whole idea is, and I put the title on here, so you probably see it. The title will be, the Yeshua required ritual purity after the events in Mark chapter 5. So let us read chapter 5. Then we're going to read this week's portion, at least verses of chapter 19. Now remember, Yeshua came and he had to observe the law. He cannot create new laws. He can teach them the proper understanding of the laws that are established by God himself on Mount Sinai. Yeshua will be exempt from doing things that were applicable to him, everything. For example, Yeshua on the earth, he did not have the legal authority to go into this part of the temple, the holy place, or the Holy Holies. He could not go into the area of the altar. He could not step on that altar. Now, is that because would that diminish Yeshua as the Messiah? No. It would actually prove that he is the Messiah because he did not go beyond the scope of legal authority that he was allowed to go into because he is from the line of Judah. Hebrews chapter 8 verse 4 says that if he was on earth, Yeshua was on earth, he would not be a priest. For there are already priests that will bring sacrifices according to the law. So there was a jurisdiction on the earth who could go to certain places. So corpse impurity were limiting to certain types of people the closer you got to the presence of God. So let me take my little, model here. So if you were an Israelite, someone who can come to this place, women and men, court of the women, and the court of Israel right over here, you have certain restrictions of when you came in contact with the dead. But they all have one thing in common. They all had to be purified by being sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer. The water and the ashes. The water came from Shiloach pool, the pool of Shiloach, and they have to be ritually cleansed. Okay? So, the higher the level of honor, in this case the priest, they had certain restrictions. When they had somebody died in their family, they could not mourn, they could not do certain things except for certain people in their family. The high priest had a higher level of freedom in what to do and what not to do in regards to a corpse, a person dying close to him. So the higher the level. An Israelite have more freedom. They still were ritually unclean to go into the temple or the temple proper because they touched the dead. Why? Because the temple and the Mount of Jerusalem reflects the realm of life where death does not live. Death cannot be present. You see that in Revelation chapter 21, verse 4. Death will be defeated. So when death is defeated, God himself is going to come down to the earth. It says that in Revelation 21, verse 1 through 8, actually. It tells us this. Okay, so understanding sacred space. Understanding the rules of corpse impurity. The issue here is, can anyone who touch the dead, can they go up to the temple without the proper ritual that would allow them to be purified to go into a different realm? Going up to Jerusalem, going up to the temple is a microcosm, as is if you go into heaven itself. Okay, it's a microcosm. So therefore, what you're doing is understanding the levels of purity and holiness. And you know this, guys. It's simple. Look, let me give you this example. If you want to have intimacy with your wife, and you came outside, like I was just there 2 hours ago training in my shed at noon. I was crazy, okay? And I was so sweaty that when my wife saw me, the first thing she goes, "You need to take a shower," And that was just me walking by her. She goes, "Go take a shower." Imagine if you want to have intimacy. You have to prepare yourself to have the encounter. Okay? In the temple, it's not fertility rituals in the temple, but you have to prepare yourself to be ritually cleansed in order to go to a high level of kedusha, holiness. And this includes if you touch a dead carcass or a dead person, you have to be sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer. That is law. It's a decree. It applies to everyone, including Yeshua, the Son of the living God, who was on the earth and touched a dead girl. Now, one of the things that happens when you read the narrative in the Bible, and I'm going to give you an example about this particular language that we use. Many people assume, well, where does the New Testament say that Yeshua needed to do the water ritual of purification? It doesn't say it there. If I say something to you, and you know how old you are by me saying this. Remember the commercial back in the day, in the 80s? Where's the beef? Or clap on, clap on. Remember that? Or I'm falling and I cannot get up. Now, do I have to explain that to people who saw it, who understood it, who live in that time frame? Or would I have to explain that to people who were born in the year 2000, in the last 22 years, who never saw that? In other words, the narrative and the language that we see here in the verses, that was written to everyone who understood these things. The writer, Mark and Matthew, they don't have to go into the minutia of every little detail explaining something to an audience that understood all these principles because they live in them. We are the ones who are from the outside, coming in trying to understand all the little details of the proper procedures that were prescribed in the Torah as to what holiness is, what purity is, what moral purity and what ritual purity is, and what idolatry is. So therefore, now, with that being said, let's get right into the verses. I want to show you the verses. We're going to run through it, but please understand that in the ancient world, that's why Mark chapter 5 is all connected with impurities. It's talking about pigs, and it's talking about a woman with the issue of blood. It's talking about a dead person. It's talking about different things that will consider you some kind of level of ritual impurity. Not moral per se, but ritual impurity. We need to know the differences. There is a big distinction. So in the temple, it required two levels of obedience: moral behavior and ritual purity in the temple and the temple proper. Any Israelite who would go up to the temple, they all have to immerse. But if you touch a dead carcass, or in this case, a dead person, you have to go through the ashes of the red heifer first, the sprinkling. So if you got immersion, but you didn't get purified with the sprinkling of the water, it's not valid. You have to have both. So the priests have to go after people every second. Did you touch a dead person? Did you touch a dead person? Did you touch a dead person? No, trust me. Everyone wanted to go to the temple, and they understood the rules of the temple. They understood them. So therefore, it was clear to them what to do when they got there. The ashes of the red heifer were kept in different places. In the north, in the south side, on the southeastern side of the entrance to the women's courtyard. Also distributed to the Levitical cities and in other places, on the Mount of Olives. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the prophetic of the red heifer right now in regards to the altar. That's a different conversation. I'm going to focus only in Mark chapter 5, verse 35. Let's go there, and then we're going to go to Numbers 19, and let's read the rules, and then we have to deduce based on obedience. If Yeshua kept every command that applied to him, then he had to keep this one. Okay? The notion that Yeshua can be abstaining from certain things because he's the Son of God when he came to the earth to uplift the Torah and to do everything correctly makes no sense. You have to recognize that doing this does not eliminate Yeshua in any way as Messiah. Okay? All right. Let's go to Mark chapter 5. Let's start reading in verse 35. It says, while he was still speaking, they came from the synagogue ruler's house, saying, your daughter has died. He was in a synagogue. It tells you right here when you read it. Okay? And it says, why trouble the teacher further? But Yeshua, ignoring what was said, told the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. And he did not allow anyone to follow along with him except Peter and John, and Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a commotion, and the ruler weeping, and the people weeping and wailing loudly. And he entered and he said to them, why are you agitated and weeping? The child is not dead. That's what Yeshua says. But the people understood that they were dead, that she was dead, but is sleeping. Okay, and they began laughing at him. But he sent them all out, took along the father and the mother, and those who were with him, and went into where the child was. And taking hold of her hand, he said to her, Talitha kumi, which is an Aramaic translation. Little girl, get up. And immediately the girl stood up and began walking around. She was 12 years old. And immediately they were utterly and completely astonished. Now, she's 12 years old. This is also a prophetic picture about Israel's resurrection from the dead because of idolatry and uncleanness. 12. It's not by coincidence her age was 12 years old. Okay? But the text tells us that she died. Okay? So understand that, no, she was sleeping. Well, Yeshua said she was sleeping, but everybody there understood she was dead, depending on the translation you read. So if the girl died and she was dead, okay, the moment he touched her, he becomes unclean with a corpse. Okay? You got to remember the eyewitness. Now, is there a story behind why Yeshua resurrected her? Was it a sin to touch a dead person? Well, I mean, some people are going to die in your family. It's not a sin. You just have to go through the process of purification. That is it. I don't understand the notion that Yeshua touching something dead would disqualify him as Messiah. And that's the problem, that for some reason, when we study the Torah, if we say something like, well, Yeshua was required to bring an offering during the holidays. He went for Passover, okay? He went for the feast. He went for certain things, so he needed to bring an offering like anybody else. That doesn't disqualify him in any way. So, as we continue to study this, we need to go now to the book of Numbers, chapter 19. Numbers 19. In the book of Numbers, right here, Numbers chapter 19, we're going to read from verse 14. And it says, this is the law when someone dies in a tent. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to read another verse here, another version. I'm going to come here real quick. I'm going to go to Mark 35. Because depending on what version, people have different arguments on that. So when I go here to these verses, let's read it again. While he was still speaking, some of the people came to the leader's house, says, your daughter is dead. Okay? So clearly, someone saw her dead. Now, please understand that the moment that person dies, the whole house becomes unclean. It's what is called the father of all impurities. The person who touched the dead has the highest degree of uncleanness. But whoever's there, you have like a second degree of uncleanness. Okay? That doesn't mean that it's a higher level. You'll still all have to go through the whole process of purification. But one, if you didn't touch it, you'll be unclean until evening. But the one who touched the dead, you'll be unclean for 7 days. That's the law. Okay? All right. So we know that she's dead. Yeshua says she's sleeping. Because in the Bible, death is synonymous with sleeping. But the witness says she was dead. They were wailing. She was dead. Okay? So we need to get that out of the picture. Just the fact Yeshua said she was sleeping, because he's trying to bring a prophetic picture behind the resurrection of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's an interpretation. Doesn't mean that she was not dead. So let's be clear. Okay, we cannot pick and choose without really being honest with the context of the text. So the girl sleep, she is asleep or dead in this case. Yeshua touched her hand, okay, and said, get up. That means that she was dead. And then he told her to get up. She got up. She resurrected. Fine. All right. Now, let's go back to Numbers. It says, this is the law, chukah. It should say the chok or chukah. And this is a very important term, the Torah. I'm sorry, the Torah in this case. Okay? When someone dies in a tent, you need to go to the Mishnah or Cholot, which means tents, and it tells you what happens to everybody in the tent. Everyone who comes into the tent, everyone who is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. So I was wrong. It's not until evening. I apologize. It's all who were inside the tent. That means that every person who was inside the house there, all were unclean for 7 days. Okay, let the Bible tell us what the definitions are. And every open vessel with no cover fastened, it is unclean. Whoever in an open field touches one, now we're talking about an open field, touches one who has been killed by a sword, or who has died naturally, or a human bone, or a grave, shall be unclean for 7 days. Notice, now this is the individual. Okay? For the unclean shall take some ashes. Now, Yeshua became ritually unclean. Guys, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Yeshua is still the Messiah. Okay? This is all ritual purity issues. Yeshua didn't sin. He touched that girl. Okay? It happens. People die all the time. But to enter, to go to the temple, to go to purification rituals, you needed back in the day, no one wanted to touch the dead. Even the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians and the Hittites, they all have rituals. They have one connection. The difference is this. They believed in the ancient world that the demons would attack you. Okay, in the Torah, it's a peace of mind. God says, you touch a dead person, the demon is not going to overtake you. You're good. Just let me sprinkle, clean water on you with the ashes of red heifer, and there, you do it. Good. You're good. Come on in. You're good. We never study the psychology of these things. It's a contrast. God is trying to make a contrast between the myth of the ancient world and how the Lord dealt with that. He says, you believe the demon's always trying to attack you. In my temple, it has no authority, guys. So let me give you a ritual to appease you. In other words, let me give you a ritual that you will know that it comes from me. If you touch a dead person and then you come to the temple and you come do the holy things and all of a sudden now you sprinkle with the ashes of the red heifer, you're good. Mentally, spiritually, you feel free that you are not in the realm of death, that you're coming into the realm of life and not defile the temple. That's the key here. This is a contrast, and I'm going to read it to you in verse 20. You need to make this connection. In verse 20, it tells you that, so you do not defile the altar. Because when Moses sprinkled the blood on the people and sprinkled the blood on the altar, every time we sin or any time there's some kind of impurity that we cause, immediately it's transferred to the temple. We now we make the temple dirty. Okay, that's just the way it was. It's called contagions. Mary Douglas has great books on this context, and the anthropologists really go deeper into this stuff, that what is contagion and all that. It's like the virus this year, the last 2 years. You can be around someone, you be in the same air, and you get sick, and you didn't see it. So they believe that death, promoted some kind of stuff, and they believe it was the demons. In the case of Israel, says there's no such a thing. That's why next week's portion is about Pinchas. Is about when Balaam and Balak, and Balaam tells Balak, he goes, there's no divination against Israel. There is no witchcraft against Israel. In other words, demons have no authority over those people who are protected and following the Torah in obedience to the Torah. We open the door by our own actions to the curses in Deuteronomy 28. So this is all designed to bring peace to the heart of the people. You didn't do anything wrong. You touched something dead. Okay, you get sprinkled with the waters of purification, the ashes of red heifer, and then you can have Passover the second month. You're good. No need to freak out. I'm not mad at you. We just go through the process, so when you step into my place that is holy, you're not going to die because you touch the dead. And in my temple, in the temple of God, it's all about life. That's why studying the temple is so significant. All right, let's continue here. It says, verse 16, whoever in the open field touches one who has been killed by a sword or who has died naturally, or a human bone or in a grave shall be unclean 7 days. For the unclean, they shall take some ashes of the burnt purification offering, that's a paraduma, the red heifer, and running water shall be added to it in a vessel. Then a clean person shall take hyssop, dipped in the water, and sprinkled it on the tent and all the furnishings, on the persons who were there. And whoever touches the bone, the slain, the corpse, or the grave, the clean person shall sprinkle the unclean ones on the third and the seventh day, thus purifying them on the seventh day. Then they shall wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water, and at evening they shall be clean. Any who, listen to this, any who is unclean, but do not purify themselves, those persons shall be cut off from the assembly. I want you to read this carefully. Any who are unclean, but do not purify themselves, those persons shall be cut off from the assembly. Don't you think Yeshua understood this part of the law? Touching the little girl who was dead and he resurrected her, that still meant that he was ritually unclean. If he went to the temple, he had to be sprinkled. He touched the dead, he had to be sprinkled, because the penalty was karetz, was divine judgment. Now, why is this? The following part of the verse tells you, any who are unclean, but do not purify themselves, those persons shall be cut off from the assembly. For they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. Since the water for cleansing has been dashed on them, they are unclean. It is a perpetual statute for them. The one who sprinkles the water for cleansing shall wash his clothes, and whoever touches the water for cleansing shall be unclean until evening. Okay, so this is the key. So Yeshua, according to Torah and the law, he had to do this ritual. This by no means diminishes Yeshua as Mashiach. It actually does the opposite. He well understood the laws as its consequences, and he would have followed them because he came to fulfill the law. He came to establish the law. There's a big message that I like to talk about there someday. When I study this, I want to study a little bit more. I want to talk about the prophetic picture behind this, because the little girl was 12 years old. It's a woman. It's a little girl. The previous story talking about the woman with the issue of blood. This is all a reference to Israel's condition, spiritual condition. Okay? Let me give you some more information before I stop here. So it says, give me 1 second. All right. So let's talk about Ezekiel. Ezekiel talks about this a little bit. Ezekiel talks about this. You will be clean. In chapter 36, verse 25 says, I will sprinkle on you pure water, and you will be cleansed from all your uncleanness, and I will cleanse you from all your idols. Okay? Now, please understand, this is not a mikvah. This is not immersion. Okay, this is sprinkling. He's bringing us from the nations. When you read the whole context, although the Bible doesn't say here that is the ashes of the red heifer, is giving you it's ritually unclean. It's coming from the nations, and we all have connection with corpse impurity. So it has to be red heifer. Every person in the millennial reign, when Mashiach returns, when we go to that temple, they all have to be sprinkled with the ashes and the water of purification, guys. It has to happen. There's nothing wrong with it. This is part to enter into God's sacred space. All right, let me give you what it says here. The Hebrew term in Ezekiel 36, the term clean, taher, occurs 3 times in this verse. It serves to underline the action that the Lord will perform in order to cleanse his people from and their land from defilement. Both ancient Israel and ancient Near Eastern societies attest to the use of water as means of ritual purification. We see that in Exodus 29:4, when he brought Aaron to do this the job, okay? But that was a mikveh. That was cleansed with water, not sprinkled, okay? Now, let me see if I can keep reading here. Let me go to the other one. This is really cool here. I want to read this part here. This is from the Sondervan, Bible background commentary. In the verse 11, when it says, whoever touches the dead body of anyone, it says the time period of impurity is common, maximum length of persons who have become unclean, yet with some form of impurity, such as contact with the red cow during the preparation process. One is rendered impure only until sundown. The attention to death impurity stands in contrast to the prevalent cult of the dead of the ancient Near East. Now you know why God wanted to make sure that you touch something unclean. You are unclean. You will be cut off if you don't be cleansed. Why? Because the ancient world practiced occult practices with the dead. So God says, in my kingdom, that's not going to fly. You will be cut off if you don't get cleansed to come see me. Okay? It says, where the ritual practice shows no concept of contracting contamination or impurity from a corpse. If you look into this particular resource, it talks about how in the ancient world, there's certain belief that, like for example, it says, in Nergal and Ereshkigal, it says, divine queen of the underworld claims that she cannot be with the holy gods who dwell above because she is impure. But it is not clear that this has to do with her contact with the dead. In other words, she was the queen of the underworld, but she will be impure if she went up to above the underworld where there was not the dead. It's kind of crazy. It was backwards. In the Torah, God is making a contrast. My world is the world of life. Their world was the world of death. God conquers death. Through the resurrection of Yeshua, once and for all, we know now that it is the God of Israel who has dominion over life and death. It's not the gods of the ancient world. They don't exist. Let's continue. Now, the cult of the dead consisted of elaborate rituals on behalf of the dead family members in order to assure life and the hereafter and placate the gods of death and the underworld. This process began with funerary rites of the deceased family members and continued well after the initial event. Mesopotamian texts from Mari, 18th century BC, prescribe offering for the dead 4 times a year, in which the name of the dead person was invoked, food presented, and water libations rendered. In regards to connecting, defiling the altar, if they did not get cleansed, it will give the impression they are doing the cult of the dead to the gods of the underworld. So God says, no, you are unclean for 7 days. You got 7 days to make sure that you're cleansed. Because I don't want anybody in Israel to project to the nations that you are doing the cult of the dead. Now, let me ask you guys a question. You can put it there in the chat on Facebook. How many of you did not know this until today? How the ancients perceived death versus the way the Torah says no connection. Someone dies, bury them the next day. That's why the Jews bury people within 24 hours. Now you understand the reason why they do it right away. They don't want anyone thinking that you are venerating and that you are worshiping anything other than the God of Israel. So the person dies, you have Shiva, you have the mourning period, but then you go out there and you bury that person to eliminate any possibility that anyone's worshiping the dead. Okay? It's very important to know. Okay, so let's continue. It defiles the temple in verse 13. Anyone who touches a corpse, a person of a human being who died, who does not purify himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. By the way, guys, the tabernacle is the same as the temple. Same rules from the tabernacle carried over to the first and to the second temple and also to the one in the millennial reign. The rules don't change because the king still lives and he lives forever. All right. So it says, the severity of death impurity is evidenced in the ritual ablution of 3rd and the 7th days. The potential of defiling the sanctuary from a distance is left unpurified, and the potential penalty of karet, being cut off from the community for failure to comply with the ordinance. This is important. When you look into Milgram in Excursus 36 of the book of Numbers, the penalty of cutting off by human, in this case is divine judgment. It was so serious for God to teach Israel not to mess around with anything connected with the dead. It was so important that God says, if you don't do this ritual after you touch anything that dies, because I know things, men are going to die, but if you don't do this ritual, you are going to be cut off, because then everyone is going to think you are worshiping the God of the underworld, and then you believe demons are going to attack you. And in this case says, no, I am the God of life. God says, I am the God of life. So therefore now, you do what I tell you, you'll be good. Let's continue. In the Hittite text, instructions for priests and temple officials, priestly sins against the sanctuary in the matter of profane fire carried a similar penalty towards the offender and his family. He who commits this sin will perish along with his descendants. Of those in the temple, none will be left living. They will perish together with their descendants. Be extremely careful concerning the matters of fire. This is what the Hittites believe. You're unclean for 7 days. Impurity, specifically because of corpse contamination, is not attested in the ancient Near East. Okay? But a notable Babylonian text evidence a 7-day period of an isolation for one who comes in contact with the dust from a place of mourning. The ritual includes reciting a namburbi, incantation, to protect from evil. You see the whole idea? It's all about protecting from evil. Offering libations to the god Shamash, the sun god. Taking a ritual bath and changing clothes, after which the offender remains secluded in the house for 7 days. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is the bottom line? The bottom line, like Yeshua, that Yeshua had to obey the Torah. He could not abstain from doing what the Torah says. Now, did Yeshua do anything wrong by touching a dead corpse? Well, there was a prescribed ritual that would allow him to be ritually cleansed. Do I believe the miracle here carries a prophetic picture about the restoration of Israel, who were unclean, abominable, because of idolatry and impurities? Yes, that's the underlying message of the miracle. But that does not exclude Yeshua from obedience. According to Torah, what to do when you touch something unclean. The Torah is very clear. We cannot massage the text in the New Testament because we cannot handle the fact that Yeshua had to go to the temple and do exactly like anybody else did. He had to obey the Torah. Now, his role was different, but his obedience was the same as you and I. His role came with a purpose. Our role is different than Yeshua's, but our obedience to the commandment carries the same weight. So all of us, we are ritually unclean. All of us, outside, even in Jerusalem, we are all ritually unclean. But we all could be and should be morally cleansed. That's what God is looking for, moral purity. But if the temple is standing and the laws are being reestablished, also ritual purity when you're entering the realm of life. And I prove it to you in the verses in the book of Revelation. So let me go to the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, chapter 21, I want you to read carefully with me what it says and who will be out of the city. Check this out. 1 through 8. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth have passed away, and the sea did not exist any longer. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out from heaven, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling of God is with humanity, and he will take up residence with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them. This is a key verse here. It's quoted 3 times in the New Testament. It's Isaiah 25, I think 25:8. And he said, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death will not exist any longer. And mourning and wailing of pains will not exist any longer. The former things have passed away. On the one seated on the throne said, Behold, I'm making all things new. And he said, Write because these words are faithful and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Aleph and the Tav, the beginning and the end. The one who is thirsty, I will give water from the spring of water to live freely, of life freely. The one who conquers will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. Now check this out. These people are going to be outside. But as for cowards, unbelievers, detestable people, murderers, and sexually immoral people, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars, they shall share in the lake of the burn with fire. They're not going to be there. That's the second death. Because nothing in the case of immorality would have a place, because then you fall into the realm of death. And the temple is the realm of life. So touching a dead corpse would bring you into the realm of death. And then God says, I'm going to bring you out of the realm of death through a simple ritual that would allow you to be in good standing with me, because touching the dead corpse now defiles the temple. Now my house is defiled by our actions. And that happened when Moses sprinkled the people with the blood and sprinkled the people with the altar. It created an indexing. In other words, whatever we do has a direct connection with profaning God's sacred space. When we learn this, then understanding sacred space becomes a little bit more tangible and easier to understand. May the Lord bless you and keep you. And the conclusion of the matter is that, yes, according to Torah, Yeshua would have had to be sprinkled with the waters of purification, which contain the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer. Does that diminish him as Messiah? No. Does that diminish him as the future king of Israel? No. Does that diminish him as Ben Adam, the son of man? No. Does that diminish him as the son of God? No. That actually establishes him as the one who obeyed the Torah and all the laws that applied to him. He cannot add or take away from the commandments. That means that in the New Testament, there are no new commandments. He had to give the proper understanding to the ones already established because he's renewing the covenant. He's not making a new one, changing his laws and his structures. Be careful how we understand Scripture, guys. If you are telling me that Yeshua didn't have to do this, the waters of purification, now you're telling me that he willfully transgressed the Torah and the penalty was cutting off. This is our Messiah we're talking about. Let us learn and educate ourselves not to eliminate him through our own understanding of being the Messiah, but learn through the temple study and the commandments to uplift the work of Yeshua and what he did, that he fulfilled every requirement in order for him to be considered Mashiach. Shalom, guys.